No crisis or aid response is ever simple or straightforward. There are so many different experiences, so many different perspectives.
I have fair amount of tolerance, but when the institutional mission of the humanitarian agency takes over the real need on the ground, I get very frustrated.
I think it's high time that we listen to the people on the ground so that they can create true humanitarian partnership.
I think it's so critical to build each response on lessons from the previous response.
We have become a much more open sector, willing to learn, willing to embrace new technologies, new ways of working.
Advocacy, fighting for justice for people in great need, is one of our most important things. We're good at it, we can become even better.
Ability to help humans who are in need is my biggest motivation.
There is nothing more challenging, but nothing more rewarding than this.
I've been working in humanitarian teams for 20 years. But before I came to this role, I was always working in designing and delivering programs in response to different crises and emergencies across the world.
I guess I'm relatively new to the humanitarian world. I studied international relations at university, which then introduced me to humanitarian challenges. I realized I want to be part of the solution. I want to contribute to this sector, but also change it for the better.
The thing I love most about my job leading ALNAP is that we get to bring together humanitarians from across the world as part of this global learning network to discuss current crises and to work together to improve future responses. We want to explore what the future of humanitarian aid looks like, what we can learn from different crises together, and how ALNAP can help the sector chart a way forward. It's a journey that started for ALNAP in the 1990s when it was set up to address failings in the humanitarian response to the genocide in Rwanda.
I found myself coming into Rwanda, working with various journalists as an interpreter. We saw survivors who were left in the hills for months with no support, with no water, with no sanitation, with no health care, with no food. And then coupled with a situation where you have hundreds of thousands of people who had crossed the border, the bodies that floated on the lake and the bodies that were still lingering and littered around Rwanda was so shocking to the rest of mankind, and that triggered that particular wave of humanitarian assistance. And my recollection to that particular event was like a total uncoordination and sometimes a total misunderstanding of the magnitude of the whole situation and where to put the support.
Thank you so much, Eric. Seeing you there and hearing you speaking is so moving. ALNAP was created as a result of the findings from the interagency Rwanda evaluation because of this feeling that the humanitarian sector needed to be better coordinated. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you saw during that time?
Most of the good will was there, but there was a lot of money being spent and without actually having a direct impact on the ground. You had people giving jerry cans or giving beans and giving cooking oil. So you make people more dependent than they should be.
If you thought back to that time, what would be the top few lessons that you really hoped that the humanitarian sector would be able to change in the way that it responded to crises now?
I think what I'll call upon is more of a collaboration, actually listening. I think it's best to actually ask for an opinion, more of understanding, more of appreciations of the culture, political landscape, social, geographical. And Rwanda has actually shifted the wind of change, if you may, where rather than saying give us support, Rwanda clearly says can we partner? Rather than calling it aid agencies or donor countries, you call them partners, developmental partners, because you want to help people to develop themselves.
The fast-swelling Zaatari camp just over the Jordanian border. This was a bare patch of desert. Now it's Jordan's fourth biggest city. 2 million Syrians have fled the country in all. It may be years before they can go home.
As someone who was born in Somalia following the Somali Civil War and moved with my family to the UK at a young age, it was always something that was at the back of my mind, the issues of displacement, migration and conflict and war and the impact that it has on people. I am here in Jordan to find out more about the humanitarian response to the refugee crisis caused by the Syrian war.
What are some of the challenges facing people in Zaatari camp?
It was a temporary solution for the refugees who are coming from Syria. And now we're 10 years later and we're still on. So the challenges are mainly divided into two main areas, which is the lack of livelihood opportunities for refugees in the camp and the freedom of movement, where refugees are facing challenges in terms of obtaining a permit for getting out of the camp, either to work or moving around or having the access to further education. We need to focus on a long-term solution for the refugees inside the camp.
لأني كنت ولا أعرف شيء إنه من الصفر بدأت من الصفر والحمد لله أخذت الخبرة الكافية. حالياً بقدم لمنظمات إنه عشان خبرتي بالخياطة بالشهاداتي وبس ما وقفت كمان بما إنه ما قبلوني فاستنى القبول وبنفس الوقت بعمل دورات.
So tell me, what needs to change for you and your family to have a future that you would like?
البيئة كمان مش مناسبة إنه شغل دائم يعني كمخيم وهيك. إذا تغير يمكن تغير وضع المعيشة أو تغير المكان رح يكون أنسب لي وأنسب لعائلتي.
After Zaatari camp, I had a lot of questions, so I'm in Oslo to speak with NRC's Secretary General to find out what he has to say.
It feels like a lot of people are just doing a lot of courses, but there's no opportunities. There's that block once they've completed that training to actually utilize that.
They have to have the right to work. And refugees are denied often the right to work because the host country doesn't want them to integrate. And we in the high north close our border to them. So we also have a job to fight to change laws, regulations, open opportunities.
The camp in Lebanon was created in 1949. The DAB in Kenya was also created in 1991. And we've now got Zaatari, which has been open for 10 years. It seems that the issue around displacement and refugee camps and the protracted nature of these issues has been around for a long time. So why has change been so slow?
Well, we're dependent on politicians, on diplomats, on political and military leaders to doing their job. And they're not really. So are we giving up? No, we're not giving up. In humanitarian work, advocacy, fighting for justice for people in great need is one of our most important things.
Direct funding to local actors has declined. Why do you think that is, and how can we ensure that funding does reach local actors directly?
I think the number one obstacle is this incredible rule book of compliance regulations from donor countries. I keep hearing again from politicians, parliamentarians, from media, etc., zero tolerance against any mistake, not a penny in the wrong pocket, etc., which means that there is now again a risk aversion. And how can you not take risk if you work in chaotic conflict areas?
It seems that the issues facing the sector in the future seem quite enormous and can be disheartening for those like myself who are starting out. So my final question to you is, what is your message to the humanitarians who are now entering the sector?
We succeed more often than we fail. So how am I still an optimist in my old age after 44 years? We are better in our aid work today than we were even 5 years ago. We will be even better in the future. You will succeed even more than we have done because you're better trained, you're better educated, you have better technology, and you have greater resources than we had in my time. I think your generation will also succeed in the area where we have failed perhaps the most, which is to prevent new suffering. And I can assure there is hope there. There is a lot of opportunities to do good.
To better understand the implications of climate change for the humanitarian sector, I'm in India to meet two organisations at the forefront of learning.
As an organization, learning is a part of our DNA. Over the last 2 decades, we have seen that it's a two-way thing. Perhaps we have unlearned a lot and the communities have taught us a lot.
So this community engagement is a critical part of building resilience. But what have you learned and improved on over the years in this way?
When we started working with communities, it took us a bit to understand what is their strength. But over the years, we have realized that they have the knowledge, they have the skills, they have the wisdom of the areas that they have been living for generations. Currently, all our projects try to draw out that knowledge, that skill set that they already have. And then we try to see how that can be used to build resilience.
There's still a sense that it's easier to attract funding, support, attention for response scenarios rather than these kind of resilience approaches. And I wonder if you're finding that.
We've spoken to people who have traditionally been investing in health, education, environment, livelihoods. And we tell them, imagine how much you lose if a disruption takes place in any one disaster. Don't you want to ensure that the supply chains in case of livelihood are strong enough that business continues without any disruptions? And then they say, you're making sense. It takes just one big shock like a flood when everything just collapses. So when we are working on these kind of nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, we are essentially creating natural buffers that can absorb such shocks. And working on wetlands has taught us that it's not just about water, it's about the entire ecosystem and how it can sustain populations, communities, and can make them resilient. It's not very visible, and sometimes that's the reason why it never gets appreciated. But I feel that these kind of efforts eventually lead to richer ecosystems, more robust communities, and more kind of resilient systems put in place.
AIDMI has a strong knowledge generation and learning component within its approaches. One of the things I find tantalising about ALNAP is our mandate to bring together and convene the sector around these collective learning issues that can't be addressed by any single agency. And I wonder if that resonated with your experience of being an ALNAP member.
Absolutely, and it resonates since the first meeting we participated in. A lot of things that we see right now, which has improved the humanitarian sector to a considerable degree, came out of that joint evaluation. And that wouldn't have happened if ALNAP had not brought these various players, actors, donors together to do that. One of the recent examples, there are quite a few, is to see that the heat wave is taking place, and what is it that we know about the overlap between disaster risk and climate risk that we can say for certain. We looked at two specific disasters. One is the tropical cyclone, and we looked at heat waves, and what are the 10 lessons that we have learned that everybody should know and implement. And in less than a few months, the lessons learned paper, looking at more than 800 peer-reviewed documents and other material, was brought together, reviewed, analyzed, synthesized, written up. And now that document is there, which I have seen multilateral banks using it because they called me to give a session on that. INGOs doing it because they've called me to give a session on that. Interagency groups are using it. It is being used by a private sector. It made a tremendous impact on the way heat waves are first recognized and ways of dealing with that.
Being here in India this week, the issue of climate change has been coming up in almost every conversation we've had around floods, heat waves, sea level rise, but also the pace of evolution of crisis type seems quite stark. And I wonder what your feelings are about the implications of that for the speed and urgency of learning processes within this context.
The systems that we are setting up are for today, but not for tomorrow, which is going to be even more crisis. So how are we going to not only catch up, but actually make a difference? And that's a huge piece of work, both in terms of learning, writing, doing, researching, that the new humanitarians need to do.
For the last stop on our journey, Zainab and I are visiting the DEC, who play an important role supporting their members to respond to emergencies. We're always hard on ourselves as a sector, but there is nothing so eye-opening as going back over 20 years of lessons papers and thinking, good grief, we don't do it that way anymore. And you have to sort of remind yourself of that journey. But what's really challenging, I think, to the sector when so much learning is individual learning. Yeah. And one of the things we realised with the Kosovo response is that even though there are so many clear comparisons to the Ukraine crisis, and because it was 20 years ago, a lot of that learning will have been lost to the humanitarian sector. And so we did some work, obviously, on an old DEC evaluation of the Kosovo response to try and sift out that learning and its relevance to Ukraine and bring it back into the conversation of the sector. I was wondering, how useful was that, and did it resonate with the response that you're currently involved in?
I can't begin to tell you how useful that was. At the start of the Ukraine crisis, we were getting quite a lot of pressure we were raising quite a lot of funding, and sometimes people want a quick solution to a wicked problem. And for us, it was saying the response requires longer term commitment and support. The people that need food, water today will need that rebuilding, reconstruction support 3 years on, 5 years on. We have been telling our stakeholders that we need to do good needs assessments, consult with communities and kind of key stakeholders, and deliver good programming. And then comes the Kosovo paper, and it was like brilliant, because it's not us saying it. We've got the evidence base, that third-party review.
One of the things that we found for where the humanitarian sector is in its evolution now, the problem is less that we haven't got evidence in learning.
Yep.
The key challenge now is how to enable humanitarians and humanitarian organisations to be able to use that.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the real challenge.
I think that's one of the frustrations, right? That you got the recommendations, putting that into practice, creating that enabling environment. The funding needs to be there, the leadership support needs to be there. I think, yeah, that is a frustration. And if you crack that, we've got it.
In all the conversations that you've had, what's one thing you found to be the most motivating?
I think it was this sense of urgency around learning. What did you find most motivating?
There was a lot that I found really motivating. I think the one that sticks out the most to me was a conversation I had with Leena, where she was speaking about her last few years working at Zaatari camp, where she mentioned that even though every day that she comes in, these are small changes, when she looks back, those changes build a bigger picture.
Rather than saying give us support, Rwanda clearly says can we partner?
The change in narrative and the change in language is an essential part of the evolution of an initiative that then can lead to shifts in action.
We need to focus on a long-term solution for the refugees inside the camp.
Seeing the living conditions was really difficult. But I think once I went to visit Jan Egeland, and he, with a lot of hope, told me about ambitions that he has for our generation and our ability to do better and improve on the work of his generation, really did ignite a lot of passion in me.
We are doing things now that we couldn't dream about doing a generation ago. So let's recognize that. My hope is that we prevent new suffering, we hand people out of dependence, and that they are put in charge.
They have the knowledge, they have the skills, they have the wisdom of the areas that they have been living for generations.
SEEDS is such a learning organisation. You can see how their approach has evolved and how they've learned and reflected over time. They link the ecological resilience with the community resilience.
I hope much more power, influence rests with the affected population, where they're holding us to account.
We know, sadly, each year there's going to be more humanitarian crises, but our commitment is to learn from them and also to increase the number of learning points and connections that we have across the world in order to make sure that we're maximising that learning for the benefit of the future responses.
All these inequalities, disparities that exist within the system, that needs to be changed. And this change cannot happen unless everybody comes together, north, south, east, west, left, right, to change the humanitarian system, to change the overall system within which we work.
Find out more at www.alnap.org.